Alrighty, so for week 9, you could think of week 9 as basically your prep for your Dev 1. Okay, everything you're going to do here, you're going to need to do for your code base. Okay, so let me walk through the concepts, show you my output, and um, hopefully kind of help you understand some of the differences that I spoke of if you watched my video for a code along for this week. Okay. All right. So what do you need to do? And the other thing, well, I was going to say the other thing, if it was me, and I probably should have said this on the code long, I would actually kind of document those steps that Andrew went through to implement local storage into his notes and his to do, right? Also, creating that functions file, right? The way of linking it, how to do the UUID, right? And here's the thing: is now you have a chance. Once now you've gone through this, now you have an opportunity to see how well you translated these concepts. Now, how this is a little different than what Dev 0 I said, don't use code that you've already seen. And I still say that's true because the pattern that we see with the way he's writing the function for handling grabbing the local storage and bringing it into the system memory, right? So those things, could probably have a similar file name. Now I'll show you how I handled that. But the idea too is that you're gathering the user input, right? And remember, one of the things, I'll show you this in a minute, but one of the things I talked about in that video was that when Andrew does his notes and his to-dos, he's just gathering the user input. He's not doing any processing to it. We, on the other hand, in our Learn Together and in our dev work are. So what you have to think about is what you get from the user, right? But then what do you want to store in local storage? Because just getting the input is, yes, part of this, but you actually need to process it. So let me just give you an example. So for mine, I ended up doing a major rewrite, which by the way, I think is a good idea sometimes. I ended up changing this from like, it's a suggestion, it's not a decision, right? Because I actually kind of thought about it in a new way last night, but it doesn't really matter. I just was, kind of, it's always good to get my head back into the coding ramp. So I redid it. And I think you all might be in the place where it's time you think about rewriting this because you're running into issues trying to do it because of the way you wrote it. Okay. But back to my example. So for me, right, I gather the current time, I gather the gym time, the start time, if I'm driving, if there's an unplanned event the day of the week. Okay, so once I fill out all those pieces of data and I say I am driving and it's Monday, okay, that's the input. I'm gathering that user input for my code then to make a suggestion. And that's me processing that input because when I hit submit, right? When I hit submit, this is going to process it, store it in local storage, and then render it back into the page. So I hit submit here, right? That's what's happened. And what I could do here, and I think I called it morning task, right? So that is the data because what I'm storing in here is the message my code created, the day, the UUID that it did. And I also ended up changing the things I could do to a list for a reason you'll see later. But the idea is that this is you gathering the user input. This is you once they hit submit, and I'll talk about validation in a minute. But once they hit submit, then you process that. Again, we all did it a little differently, which would make sense. For me, I outputted the suggested task. I gave them a fun message, and then I ended up adding this to it, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I want you to have that distinction in your head as you're looking at this first one. And then I also created the functions.js. I want you to do the same thing. Place your functions into that file. Now, I added several DOM rendering functions to my output, and I definitely recommend you do because here's the deal. You do not want, and let me just kind of show you this. There's my UUID setting at that same level. Here's my functions file. Okay. So you definitely don't want long functions that do a lot of work because they are hard to troubleshoot. As a matter of fact, some of you, that's the rewrite you probably want to be thinking of. Okay, is how to make these functions what I would term stackable, meaning one function that calls another function that returns something that it can use in its processing. Because when many of you are writing functions and then just calling them right after, you're not really getting the full benefit of writing good, concise functions. Okay. But you definitely want to write some rendering, right? Because look at what I did here on mine is not only did I add some CSS to highlight that entry, like as an example, if I do another day, if I say 6 o'clock, my gym time is 7, right? I'm driving and the day of the week is Tuesday. Then what happens is I get that next suggested list of tasks out. Okay. And in order to do that, I had to do some things related to making a div for this, formatting it the way I wanted to, right? And that's the part that honestly I have fun with because it's the part of kind of thinking about how the user might use it. Okay, coming back here. And this is exactly what I was just talking about, is updating your rendering functions to add functionality and or output from processing the user input. Now, for me, what that looks like is what I told you about, like, here's the output, but I'm also going to add this question for the user to give me feedback, like, because and there's other reasons I actually ended up doing this I won't get into, but this was a piece of functionality I need to wire up the last piece of it. But like I asked the user once I suggested these tags, what were these tasks doable, right? And I almost want to put a check mark beside each one for data collection because basically that's what I ended up changing this concept to, was from a decision to a data collection to see how well my logic was doing. Like, is it really reflecting, was it doable based on that piece of information? Anyway, I just want to give you that. And you could implement something as easy as a delete. Not easy. I mean, he showed us how to do how to actually delete one of your entries. You could do that for this particular one. But I also want you to think about, it's a real tempt to just redo what he did. And it maybe in one sense, in your first go at this, you might do that, but then go back and really make it your own based on your own code base, your own decision path. Okay. So implementing the UUID, I talked about that last time on the code up, but I also wanted you to know this. For the public repo, I did the similar thing where I put that UUID file in the base of my public. That way, when I go to use it for any of my other coding projects that we do, I already have it there. And that reference is exactly what I said before, where you can just stack this from, the lower one as the app, because the app's going to need the functions loaded and the functions is going to need the UUID. So, and by the way, in the video that I'm about to finish up talking about, he actually puts these scripts up in the head section, but he put something called deferred. So I've seen it both ways, and we could talk about the benefits. But for this point, I just want you to know you will see something a little different in the last piece. Okay, the last piece of this is and I talked about this last week, is from here forward, we are implementing something that Andrew is not in the course, and it's form validation. And I showed you last week the minimum you have to do in order for you to get the points for this one, which I need to make sure I've added up all the points here to equal the total points. You need to do something besides just required. And I'll show you what I did. And this video, I think, does a really nice job of giving you a simple approach. I think David actually posted a link in attendance for week 8 as well that helped cover some of that. Another example from W3 School. So here's what I did. On my form, is I ended up, before my first value was the first value in the list of options. So what I mean by that is here, where I said select time, this was the first value. So I ended up adding a value of 0 with nothing in there so that I could then test for the condition of the value. And in this case, I should have converted this to an actual value, but it's a string 0. Doesn't quite matter. But here's what happens is when I hit submit, if the user doesn't provide anything, A, it doesn't run. Okay, and B, it outputs some content. So how I did that, and I definitely recommend you watch this, but here's how I did it. I used Web Dev Simplified's idea of actually setting up a message. And this was just an array. And then I just did an or. If any of these were equal to the string 0, then I push a message. And here is the key to this validation is not only giving the user a message, but not running the actual process of submitting, right? If there is an error, if there is an error condition, okay? And then if that error message, that array length is greater than 0, then and he showed this in his, I named mine a little different. That's what I tend to do because I just like to give it my own names because naming is one of the harder things in programming. But I gave it, this is me pointing to that I created a div in here and then you joining, because you might actually, and he showed how to catch for, different error conditions. But at minimum, you want at least one, okay? And that's your requirement for this week. Okay. Oh, I did put it 15 points there. So it all adds up to 100 because always you get 25 for doing it on time. And I talked here about, right, when you're replying, if you have your code submitted by that Wednesday morning and it's gradable, right, no replies. Although again, I have to emphasize, I think it's really good to do them. But anyway, hope this helps. Talk to you later.